Here we are just a few days before the end of the year of 2016, and there's so many things that are going on that have prophetic significance especially in the United States and the Middle East. The news is just so full of amazing developments, and so I want to talk about this for just a minute. First of all, one of the biggest items on the agenda is the fact that the United States now has a new president in Donald Trump, and he'll be inaugurated on January the 20th. And some of the appointments he has made for positions in his cabinet and his leadership team have some definite prophetic significance. Certainly, his choice for an ambassador to Israel in David Friedman is going to have a far-reaching effect. David Friedman is a far cry from what we've had in the past. The previous U.S. ambassadors to Israel over the last 8 years have been quite amazingly adversarial toward Israel, as has been President Obama. The two-state solution has been on the table, but there's not been any progress made in any direction in that respect, except for the fact that a lot of people right now are talking about a complete abandonment of the two-state solution in Israel. And we know that the scriptures teach us that at least the Temple Mount is going to be divided when Jesus comes. The temple is going to be there, the third temple is going to be there, and it's going to be cordoned off, as it were. And the scripture tells us that when the angel told John to measure it, he instructed him to measure the temple, but not to measure the outside of the temple, because it was given to the Gentiles, which indicates to us that only the holy temple of the Jews will be dedicated to them, and the rest of the Temple Mount, and presumably the rest of Jerusalem will be under the control of the Gentiles. Now, that could be that the Temple Mount itself would continue as it is under Muslim control, the Islamic Waqf, WAQF, and it could be that by this time East Jerusalem will have become the capital of a Palestinian state, and thereby Jerusalem will be divided. We don't know for sure how that's going to all work out. But David Friedman's appointment to this role as the ambassador to Israel is going to have a far-reaching effect, for the simple fact that Friedman has been known for his very much pro-Israel stance. Donald Trump, in his campaigning, told us that he was going to make sure that we move the American embassy to Jerusalem. That's going to be a big deal, and that he was going to leave it up to the people of Israel and Palestine to determine their outcome on this thing. So at least in some measure, Donald Trump has indicated that he wants Israel to have a say in their destiny. This is a little bit contrary to what the international community is saying right now, because since the days of Martin Indyk, the former ambassador to Israel, Martin Indyk has even though he's a Jew, has become quite hostile to the nation of Israel. He's very much in favor of a two-state solution. He was a ambassador under Bill Clinton and has worked closely with President Obama. And so we've got a lot of people that have been in the previous administration that have been adversarial to Israel, and we're going to see that change dramatically, it appears to be, under Donald Trump. Here it is a few days before Christmas, and the news is that Donald Trump has again reiterated that he intends to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. What is the significance of moving our embassy to Jerusalem? Well, it's a major deal, because ever since the United Nations passed United Nations Security Council Resolution 181 in 1948 that produced the State of Israel, the consensus has been there, and of course it's in that resolution, that Jerusalem is not under the sovereignty of Israel, but it's an international city, as it were, under the influence of the United Nations. I think it's an interesting thing, and I like to tell people about the fact that the United Nations doesn't indeed have quite a domineering presence in the city of Jerusalem. I was just in Israel about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and while I was there, I showed those the tour members the hill across the way from the Temple Mount. If you look down south of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, across the city of David, you'll see what is called the Hill of Evil Counsel. And It's called the Hill of Evil Counsel because this is the place where Judas Iscariot met with the high priest and betrayed Jesus Christ to the high priest. That's where he collected his 30 pieces of silver. So for centuries, that hill has been called the Hill of Evil Counsel. Now, in modern times, it's interesting to note that the Hill of Evil Counsel has become the headquarters of the United Nations troops there, the people that supervise the peace of Jerusalem under the United Nations auspices. And so you can look right there and you see this big building with the United Nations flag waving, and it's just a symbol of how the world community, the international community, is basically in control of Jerusalem. Now, admittedly, Israel, the state of Israel, has exercised a de facto sovereignty over the city of Jerusalem. The IDF and the state police pretty much govern this whole area as if Jerusalem is in fact the capital of Israel. But the international community does not recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. In fact, all of the embassies that from around the world, from the nations around the world, every nation who has an embassy in Israel has their embassy in the city of Tel Aviv, which is on the Mediterranean coast, about 35 miles away. Nobody has their embassy in Jerusalem. But this year, I happen to know that the property that the United States has ownership of, which will be the location of the new embassy, is in the Talpiot neighborhood of Jerusalem. And so, as we were coming back up from the city of Bethlehem a few weeks ago, I asked the bus driver of our group to drive us by the Talpiot neighborhood and let us take a look at that property where the embassy would be built. And we saw that property, and as we passed by, I took some pictures, and the guide told us that the interesting thing about that property is that was the very same location where General Edmund Allenby camped out the British troops in 1917 at the capture of the city of Jerusalem from the Ottoman Turks. So this is quite a famous piece of property, and it is going to make an interesting location for the United States Embassy. If the United States does indeed put the embassy there, it will be after many presidencies, about 5 or 6 presidencies have been under a congressional mandate to build an embassy there, but yet they have, about every 6 months, they have issued an executive order that would stay or postpone the construction of the American embassy there, for the simple reason that anybody can foresee that the building of the United States Embassy is going to be a major, major world event where the United States actually recognizes that Jerusalem is indeed the capital of Israel. And as Ariel Sharon said to the United Nations in 2005, it is the eternal capital of Israel. It has always been and always will be the capital of the people of God. In fact, I'll say the capital of God himself on this earth. You see, the city of Jerusalem was picked out by God in ancient times when God told Abraham to go to Mount Moriah and offer up Isaac. That was God himself selecting Israel, because Mount Moriah is what we now know as the Temple Mount. The rock on which Abraham offered Isaac is the very location on which Solomon's temple was built. And if you go to the Dome of the Rock today, you'll see that inside the Dome of the Rock, of course, the Muslims won't let Gentiles or won't let Christians and Jews inside the Dome of the Rock in these days. But inside the dome is the rock, and I've seen it in years past, the rock where Abraham offered up Isaac. And so my point is, Abraham didn't choose Jerusalem, and Abraham didn't make Jerusalem famous. This was God's idea. It was God's idea to choose out Jerusalem. In fact, you'll see in the Old Testament prophets how God spoke of Jerusalem as a castaway city that God had mercy on and saved them. And so there's a lot of history with the city of Jerusalem that comes from the scriptures, and it goes back thousands of years. For one thing, when Abraham came back from the battle of the kings with the 5 kings, the Bible said he saw and met Melchizedek, the king of Salem. Well, that Salem is what we now know as Jerusalem, or Jerusalem in ancient times, the city of peace. So Melchizedek dates back to Jerusalem. Abraham dates back to Jerusalem. Isaac dates back to Jerusalem. And of course, Jerusalem was one of the first cities that Joshua had to deal with when he came into the land of Canaan. They were one of the first adversaries of the children of Israel. And so it was that David became a great hero of Israel when he conquered the city of Jerusalem in his day. And David made Jerusalem the capital of Israel. And if you remember the story of David when he numbered Israel, the Bible said that God became displeased with David because he began to trust in his armies and not in the hand of the Lord. And for the sin of numbering Israel, God sent an angel to Jerusalem and began to smite David's armies. And there were 75,000 men who died before David finally began to complain to God that this didn't seem right to him. And Nathan the prophet called David and said, God wants to meet you at the threshing floor of Ornan. Now the threshing floor of Ornan was the very same location that Abraham had offered up Isaac there on that rock. And so David went up to the Temple Mount, which wasn't the Temple Mount at that time, and he met an angel of the Lord there at the threshing floor of Ornan, and the angel rebuked him for having numbered Israel. David repented of his sin, and the angel stopped the execution of soldiers, and then the angel gave David instructions to purchase the threshing floor of Ornan. So David went to Ornan and offered to buy the property. Ornan offered to give it to David as a gift to David and to the Lord and to the nation. But David, as you remember, said, I can't take anything that doesn't cost me something, and won't give the Lord anything that doesn't cost me something. So David actually purchased that piece of property that is now the Temple Mount. And the significance of that is King David is the title landowner. He has the deed. He's the man that paid the money to own the temple. And of course, as you know, in David's time, he desired to build the holy temple there. And God wouldn't allow him to build it in his time because he said he was a man of blood, a man of war. But he did allow, and God prophesied that David's son, Solomon, would indeed build that temple. And so there's so much history on this mountain, and it's all God's choosing. David didn't choose that mountain to make it holy or to make it famous, but God called David to the mountain, and an angel of the Lord met David there on the mountain. So all of this is God's doing. Abraham's presence on the mountain was God's doing. David's presence on the mountain was God's doing. And so God has chosen Jerusalem to be his capital on earth. Then, of course, when Solomon dedicated the temple that he built there in the years to follow, the Bible tells us in 2 Chronicles 7 how that when he prayed the dedicatory prayer, that the presence of the Lord came so strong into the temple that the priests couldn't even stand. They just were humbled in the presence of God there. And there God made them promise that he was going to dwell in Jerusalem, and he was going to make the holy temple his home in Jerusalem. And God established his presence in Israel at that time, in Jerusalem, in the holy temple. And he promised that he would stay there in that temple, and that he would stay there in the city of Jerusalem as long as the children of Israel kept the commandments of God and honored him and served him. But God also promised Solomon that if the children of Israel backslid, if they apostatized, if they rejected the commandments of God and continuously disobeyed, that God would destroy the temple, and that he would forsake Jerusalem, and he would scatter the people from there. And you know how the history of Israel went. Surely enough, in centuries to follow, the children of Israel rejected God. They ceased to follow him. You remember how that Jeroboam took the northern 10 tribes of Israel away from Jerusalem and went to Samaria and started, as it was, another nation of Israel that had the northern 10 tribes. Then Rehoboam stayed in the south in Jerusalem and kept the tribes of Benjamin and Judah. That came to be known as the nation of Judah. And so all of this began to see the fulfilling of prophecy. God had told them, he sent prophets to them. He tried to bring them to repentance. He tried to get them to return to obedience to the commandments of the Lord. And yet again and again the prophets were rejected. And the northern kingdom never, ever had another righteous king after their apostasy began in the time of Rehoboam and Jeroboam. However, in the southern kingdom of Judah and Benjamin, there were a few righteous kings like Josiah and Hezekiah and others. And so God spared Israel as it was until finally, in the days of Isaiah and Jeremiah, God had prophesied that if they didn't get right, he was going to send Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, in to take them captive. And surely enough, Jeremiah saw that day come when the children of Israel were taken captive by the armies of Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar's troops took them off. They slaughtered many of them in the valleys around Jerusalem, and finally they took them off in chains to Babylon. That's when the story of Daniel was told, how that Daniel was taken as a young prince of Israel away from Jerusalem. If you read the book of Isaiah, in the days of King Uzziah, you remember how Isaiah said, in the days of King Uzziah, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. That reveals to us that in Isaiah's day, the throne of God was actually in the temple of God in Jerusalem. Isaiah saw the Lord in this vision, high and lifted up, his train filled the temple. He saw, as it were, God on his throne in the holy temple in Jerusalem. Then when you read the book of Ezekiel, the first 2 or 3 chapters of Ezekiel, you see Ezekiel describing the throne of God. He saw the throne of God. It had a sapphire foundation under it. He saw these 4 beasts underneath, the wheels within wheels, and the beast, one had a calf's face and a lion's face and an eagle's face and a man's face, and all of these were the living chariot of God, as it were. And later Ezekiel saw how that these living creatures lifted up the throne of God out of the holy temple in the time of the Babylonian captivity, and he saw, as it were, the temple, the throne of God leave the holy temple from Jerusalem. He saw it ascend over the eastern gate, and it went to Babylon. And so we can see that God's throne lifted up, and that was according to the prophecy that he had prophesied under Solomon, that if the people did not obey his commandments and serve him in love, that he would abandon Jerusalem and he would abandon the temple, and surely enough he did that. But when Jesus comes back, Jerusalem again will become the capital of Israel. And Jesus will have his throne there for 1,000 years, and he'll build a temple there for 1,000 years. But now, we're waiting to see what's going to happen prophetically with this holy city of Jerusalem. And with a new president here that says we're going to put the United States Embassy in Jerusalem, this is a phenomenal thing that's about to happen. The largest, most powerful nation on earth, the United States of America, if Donald Trump fulfills his pledge, the United States will be the first to recognize on the world stage that Jerusalem is indeed the eternal capital of Israel. Now that's an exciting thing for Jews. That's an exciting thing for Christians. But it's not an exciting thing for Muslims. And you can believe that if and when this happens, that it's going to create a great backlash on the part of the Islamic world. And of course, there's a lot of people in America on the left side of the political spectrum who are greatly opposed to the nation of Israel. They're opposed to the Jews, they're opposed to the Jewish religion, and they're certainly opposed to Jewish sovereignty over the city of Jerusalem. And there's going to be a lot of trouble that's going to come out of this. A lot of the other impact of this decision, if indeed Trump does put this embassy in Jerusalem, is that the world will begin to be forced to reckon with Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. That's going to throw a monkey wrench in this whole Palestinian two-state solution. It's going to throw a monkey wrench in the United Nations quartet that's been working so long to create a Palestinian state. It's going to throw a monkey wrench in the whole political situation that calls for East Jerusalem to be the capital of the Palestinian state. In fact, there's a lot of talk nowadays that because of the way Israel is handling the settlements and refusing to abandon the settlements, that we have effectively lost the whole prospect of a two-state solution, and that we're now looking at a near inevitable one-state solution where there will not be a Palestinian state, but that that Israel will continue to expand its sovereignty over the entire region. Now, along with the new President Trump in America, we have a couple of other things that's going on. One of them is the fact that the United Nations has just installed a brand new Secretary General. You know that Ban Ki-moon has been the Secretary General for the last 2 terms, and now his term is expired. And the new Secretary General is a man named Antonio Guterres. He was the former president of Portugal. He is a socialist Catholic. He is complicit, as it were, with the Pope. He's going to have a Catholic point of view on a lot of these things. He's going to have a socialist point of view on a lot of what he does at the United Nations. But he does have a reputation for being pro-Israel. And so there are some people that are expecting this new Secretary General of the United Nations to be pro-Israel. It's going to be an interesting thing because, as you probably know, the United Nations now for the past 60 years has manifested a very anti-Israel position. It is an astonishing thing how many of the United Nations Security Council resolutions have been anti-Israel. Even in recent weeks, we have seen the United Nations vote in UNESCO, United Nations Educational and Scientific Council. UNESCO voted to call the Temple Mount a Muslim heritage site, the World Heritage Site that is predominantly a Muslim history. They in the resolution that UNESCO passed, they completely failed to recognize any historical connection between the Temple Mount and the Jews or the Christian. They call it Al-Aqsa Mosque, and this is a bad thing. This is a bad thing. And even Ban Ki-moon, in leaving office, as he left office, he condemned UNESCO for not having recognized that the Temple Mount has in fact got thousands of years of history with both Jews and Christians. And so the United Nations is going through some real upheavals here. And the third element that I want to talk before I get through, I don't have a lot of time left, but President Obama now, as a lame duck president, is threatening to do some things, and it may be before this video, even before you even see this video, this thing could have turned, because so many people are worried that he is going to sit out a resolution at the United Nations to declare, as it were, a 2-state solution. If he does not veto a resolution that could be submitted either by the Palestinians or perhaps by the French or who knows who else, if the United States does not veto this pro-Palestinian resolution, it could be that within the next few days we'll be looking at a Palestinian state or perhaps a deadline for a Palestinian state. This is a major development. One of the things that we want to look for, one of the things that's particularly of importance, if we see a resolution that's brought forth that calls for Israel to pull out of the West Bank within 7 years, this would have all the characteristics of what Daniel in the 9th chapter of Daniel called the confirming of the covenant. If we get a resolution from the United Nations that requires Israel to pull out of the West Bank within 7 years, that resolution could very possibly become the great prophesied covenant that will be confirmed, as it were, by the Prince of Rome. If we see such a resolution come forward with that 7-year clause in it, and if the Pope of Rome, if Pope Francis immediately comes forward with a major Roman Catholic endorsement, we may have witnessed within the next few days or weeks the prophesied confirmation of the covenant. And if that's the case, we will have begun the last 7 years of Daniel's 70th week, which means from the confirmation of the covenant, we would be 3.5 years until we see the abomination of desolation. The man of sin will be standing in the newly built third temple, and then the great tribulation will begin. The mark of the beast will be issued. The 144,000 Jews will be sealed. The 6th trumpet war will come. 1/3 of the world population will die. And of course, that will all end. The 42 months of great tribulation will end with the 7 vials of the wrath of God, and finally the great and final battle of Armageddon, and the second coming of the Lord Jesus Christ, the first resurrection of the dead, and the rapture of the church, the catching away of the church. Folks, we're looking at the possibility that we're in the very last few days and moments of Bible prophecy. We could be looking within the next 7 or 8 years at the Battle of Armageddon, and you need to know that, and you need to prepare your heart to meet God. I'll be back with more of this on the next episode of this program. God bless you.